All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming and joining us today at the Jessica Day George panel. We're so excited to have you guys here. Really quickly, before we get started, just a reminder that you are more than welcome to talk in the chat to each other. Please keep it appropriate, though. We appreciate you guys being kind to each other. If you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A box, not the chat. We're more likely to see it if it's in the Q&A box. We'll do questions about 5 minutes before our session's up. And another reminder that if you want to purchase any of Jessica's books or any of the other books by our lovely authors at this event, you can do so at the King's English Bookstore. I'll drop that link in the chat in a moment here. But before I do that, I want to introduce our author to you. So here is a little bit about Jessica Day George. Jessica Day George is the New York Times best-selling author of over a dozen middle grade and young adult fantasy books. She lives in Utah with her family and likes knitting, dark chocolate, and small dogs. And her latest book, Writer's Reign, came out in the height of COVID, but you should check it out because it is a wonderful tale. And she will tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But without further ado, take it away, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Oh, I should have asked how long I have. Do I have till the hour?
Yes, you have until 4.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. All right. So hello, everybody, and welcome to Seeing Me Talk. And we are going to talk about fairy tales. I'm a huge fairy tale fan. Always loved them as a kid. I love the Disney versions. I love, the real gritty retellings and all those things. Big fan. I had to grab some of my favorites off my shelves behind me. Briar Rose by Jane Yolen, The Nightingale by Cara Dalkey, which my copy is real destroyed, and Tamlin by Pamela Dean. I love retold fairy tales. And so, funny thing, I've ended up doing 4 of them so far and have plans for more because I love doing a retold fairy tale especially. And so it's kind of funny, we were saying about the Writer's Reign. So this is the last book in my most recent trilogy. And I have gotten so many emails about like, well, what fairy tale is that based on? And Tuesdays at the Castle, when I wrote Tuesdays at the Castle, people are like, well, what fairy tale is that? Because I think people just sort of expected me to be writing about fairy tales, and they were very confused when it was my own story. And so I guess, though, in a manner of speaking, the Rose Legacy, the Writer's Reign books sort of were a fairy tale for me, and so was Tuesdays at the Castle, because as a little kid, that is what I used to dream about and fantasize about, was if I lived in a castle and had a pet griffin or a pet dragon, or if I had my own horse. So they're sort of like I was writing my own fairy tales. But we are going to talk about actual fairy tales and rewriting them, because I always joke with people that is what my degree is in. I have a degree in humanities from BYU, and when you do humanities, then you have to focus on something like smaller, because humanities is like every type of art, architecture, literature, it's everything. And so they make you focus on something like then English teaching or art history or something like that. And my focus was called comparative literature, which is reading literature in the original. So in order to do comparative literature, I had to be fluent in 2 other languages, and I had to take upper level literature classes in those languages. So I was fluent at the time, I'm a little less fluent now, in German and Norwegian. And what I studied was German and Norwegian fairy tales for my focus in my major. And then I minored in Scandinavian studies, which also had me reading a ton of fairy tales and Norse myths in the original languages. Gorgeous, my favorite thing. So I'm big into fairy tales. So I'm going to teach you to figure out how to write your own fairy tale, or retell your own myth, or retell your own old book. And so I'm going to say fairy tale when I'm talking about it, but this is sort of like a general guideline for if you have always wanted to rewrite your own version of, something like Peter Pan, or if you've always wanted to rewrite your own version of Pride and Prejudice. We're just going to say fairy tale, but it could cover anything. Myths from around the world, stories and folktales from around the world, classics. So that's the first thing we need to talk about, is when you are um, deciding I would like to write this version of this story because it's my favorite fairy tale, or my favorite book is Pride and Prejudice and I want to write my own version of it, the first thing you need to look at is like that story. Like, okay, I want to write a sequel or a retelling of this, and I'm just going to say fairy tale now because it takes too long. But anyway, I'm going to retell this fairy tale. The first thing you need to look at is, can I retell that fairy tale? And not because there are a lot of versions of a lot of these stories out there. I mean, I've written a version of Cinderella. Gail Carson Levine's Ella Enchanted is a version of Cinderella. Julia Barry wrote The Amaranth Enchantment, which is a version of Cinderella. And there is always room for more. It's a beautiful story. It's a very popular story and people love it. So I'm not talking about like, oh, should I rewrite Cinderella? There's so many versions, because you're going to make that story your own. There is no reason why you can't do a version of it. But what I'm actually talking about is legally, can you retell that story? If you want to do something like, I am going to write my own retelling of Peter Pan or Harry Potter or something like that, you need to look at whether or not you can. Because stories that are books that are written by one person that are less than 100 years old are actually owned by that person or their family. So legally, you would have to get their permission to either write a sequel or to retell that story. That is why there are so many different versions of something like Pride and Prejudice, or, even like there's sort of some Peter Pan stuff going on, but there are no retellings of Harry Potter right now because J.K. Rowling is alive and owns the rights to that. So if you are looking at a more recent book that was written by an author that you want to do your own version of it, you need to look at whether or not the rights are still held to that. And it's easy to do. You can just flip to the front of the book and look at the copyright and see if the copyright is held by the estate of or by an author or something like that, and look into that. If you do want to write something like write an extra chapter of Harry Potter or another book or something like that, you can do fan fiction, of course, and there's huge amounts of fan fiction online. But the deal with fan fiction is you're not making a profit on it. It is for free. If you want to write a book, publish it, put it on shelves, have people pay you money to read it, it has to be free and clear estate-wise. That's why The Great Gatsby just came into what's called the public domain. So like fairy tales are the public domain. Greek myths, folk tales from around the world, mythology, they're in the public domain because, for one thing, they're retold stories, and so they never did have a primary author usually, but also they're very old. But The Great Gatsby just hit the mark where it came into the public domain, and literally a day later, there was a book on the bookshelves called Nick, which is a sequel to The Great Gatsby. And so someone had written that book, they had sold it to a publisher, they had edited it, it had a cover that matches a Great Gatsby cover, it's an unofficial sequel, but they had to wait until basically the ball dropped on that deadline in order to publish his book. So that's something you need to look into if you want to do a retelling is this public domain? Is this free and clear? Is it Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, Theseus and the Minotaur? Can I just go ahead and retell it? Or is this like, my favorite book is Paula Danziger's This Place Has No Atmosphere from 1986. Like, you need to look at whether or not you can actually tell that story and figure it out. So we're going to assume now that we've looked and we're all just going to do a fairy tale, just a free and clear public domain retelling of Little Red Riding Hood. I'll just keep using that one for my example. So you figured it out. Your story is Little Red Riding Hood. It's public domain. Great. Then you need to look at something else. The version of the story that you are thinking of that you are going to retell, is that a real public old-timey version of the story, or is it Disney or some other version of the story? So because here's the thing, and again, love Disney, nothing but love for Disney, sitting here in my desk covered with like Disney products, like Sword in the Stone swag and stuff like that from Disneyland. But the thing is, they have retold those stories so many times, and it's ubiquitous. There are tie-in books, there are t-shirts, there are movies and direct-to-DVD sequels of so many fairy tales and myths now that we kind of assume that that is the real one. But in reality, that's the Disney version or the hoodwinked version or the Hollywood version of that story or the Random House Book of Fairy Tales version of that story. That is someone else's story. And so you need to look at that. It was very interesting when I did the 12 Dancing Princesses, and I did it as a book called, oh my gosh, Princess of the Midnight Ball. Princess of the Midnight Ball. I loved that story growing up, but I realized as I started to look into it that what I loved was there was a very specific picture book that I had. Beautiful, like full color art. If you've ever seen a James Christensen, it was similar to that, where there were all these little details and hidden things in it. And the other thing I loved was the Fairy Tale Theater. It was a TV series in the 80s called Fairy Tale Theater. I love the Fairy Tale Theater version of the 12 Dancing Princesses. So I looked into that and they were very different. I reread I watched my TV show because I hadn't seen it in over 20 years, and I reread my picture book, and I realized that they were very different. So I started looking at other ones. It's a German fairy tale, and I looked it up and could not find it in either my in German version of Grimm's fairy tales or my English version of Grimm's fairy tales until I realized that the title of that story in German is basically, at least in the edition I have, is The Princesses Who Danced All Night Long. And in English, it was called, I've got like some big old, college tome of fairy tales that I used as a textbook, basically. And in English, in my book, it is called The Princesses Who Danced Until Their Shoes Wore Out. There is nothing that I could find in an older book called The 12 Dancing Princesses. I could find a little golden book version. I could find a picture book version. I could not find anything older than like 1980 that was called The 12 Dancing Princesses. So I ended up looking at like 6 different versions and realizing that the picture I had in my mind of that story that I was going to tell was actually the TV show that I'd seen as a kid. So I was about to just basically write down this TV show. And I was like, well, that's no good. Can't do that. So I needed to figure out what was the original version and how I wanted to tell it. So what were the things that I loved about that story? And what were the things that I hated? And the real thing you need to look at is, what did you hate? And that sounds so weird because you know what you love in a story. You know exactly what you're going to use for a story. Because when you go to write a story, 12 Dancing Princesses, Little Red Riding Hood, Theseus and the Minotaur, you're going to write that story because there's some aspect of that story that really appeals to you and you are excited to write it down. But you need to look at what you hate about that story. I just saw someone in the chat talking about doing a version of The Little Mermaid. Absolutely. The Little Mermaid, the original story, not the Disney version, is horrible. It's just the worst. It's so sad and depressing. It's just, and like many of these, like many fairy tales, it's really violent and gory. But so there's something that this person loves over here in the chat. I'm gesturing to the chat if you can't tell. Over here in the chat, there's something that that person loves about The Little Mermaid, but I bet there are things that they hate and that they want to fix. And that's the reason why you need to look at what you hate. You need to look at what you hate because you need to decide what part of the story you're going to discard because you hate it and what part you're going to fix. And here's the thing. You might think, I'm going to write a version of The Little Mermaid where I just totally get rid of the ending because it's so bleak and awful. Okay, but that's what makes the story the story. You're going to have to come up with your own entire new story then if you absolutely throw it away because you hate it. You're going to have to come up with something that is completely different from the ending in the Disney movie, so that the Disney lawyers don't come after you, So instead of, very rarely, when I've looked at a story or something that I want to tell, even using experiences from my own life. Like a book I'm working on now is actually sort of based on like a really weird old house that I lived in for a little while when I was a teenager. And I was like, yeah, if I had to go back and write about living in that house, I would absolutely never talk about this, this, or this, because it was gross, and like the paint was a terrible color and blah, blah, blah. But that is what makes the house interesting. This house had been like decorated like in different decades and then left that way. So there was like a 70s room and a 50s room and an 80s room, and it was totally not intentional. It was not supposed to be cool or like a museum. It was just ugly. And if I went through and started talking about like, oh, I lived in this house, but did not tell you the parts of it that I hated, like the way it smelled or the 70s wallpaper, you would be like, yeah, boo-hoo, you lived in a house? Like we all live in a house, you know? So what made that house interesting and worth telling a story about is how awful it looked and the reaction that we had to living there. And so the parts you hate of a story that maybe the reason why you're retelling that story is to fix it, it's often better, instead of just throwing something out, it is a good idea to look at it and see how you can fix it. You want to fix it. And I just saw somebody saying, I've never seen the Disney Little Mermaid. Is it worth watching? Yeah, it's got great music, really fun. It's totally fun, but it just has a happier ending. There's actually a Japanese version from the early 80s that I do believe they copied a little bit. Instead of Flounder the fish as her friend, she had a little baby dolphin that followed her around. But it is, if you can find it, I think it might be available to watch on YouTube. There's a version of the Little Mermaid, she's blonde, that's closer to the end. So it actually has the ending where she's supposed to take a knife, kill the prince, rub his blood on her legs, and have him turned back into a fin. That is what happens towards the end of the Little Mermaid. And you have to look up yourselves whether or not she does it. Anyway, so what you're doing with a fairy tale is you're taking the parts that you love and you're highlighting those, and you're taking the parts that you hate and you're fixing them, instead of just entirely throwing them out, which I feel like is what Disney did with The Little Mermaid, where they just came to a point at the end where they're like, oh, that's so sad. Let's just erase that whole ending and write our own new one. But instead of doing that, I think it's more interesting to say, okay, how could we take this ending that is so sad and make it better? And I talked about using Little Red Riding Hood as an example. So I've done a version of Little Red Riding Hood. It's called Princess of the Silver Woods, and it's about one of my 12 dancing sisters from the Midnight Ball. And what I did with it, I've never really cared one way or the other about Little Red Riding Hood. I'm not like a huge Little Red Riding Hood fan. I don't really care, except when I was doing my degree and had to read the original story in college. I thought it was hilarious because, I mean, first of all, the fact that Red cannot tell the difference between a wolf in a bonnet and her grandma really makes you wonder about that child, right? So she had some issues that needed to be fixed. But the other thing about that story is Little Red Riding Hood in the original does not have a woodsman in it. If you know the story, she goes, you know, she's not supposed to leave the trail. She's not supposed to talk to anybody. She talks to the wolf. He tells her to go off the trail and get grandma some flowers. She does it while she's busy doing that because she's taking so long. He cuts around, goes to grandma's house, eats grandma, dresses in grandma's clothes. Little Red comes in. What big eyes you have, what big teeth you have. Can't tell the difference between a wolf and her grandma. The wolf eats her as well. A woodsman comes in, uses his axe to chop open the wolf, and pulls out Grandma and Little Red. Now, I have seen this either as in more recent versions that the wolf is now dead, or I have seen them sew the wolf's stomach up with rocks and the poor wolf staggers off in the woods with his belly so full of rocks. The actual version of Little Red Riding Hood, Little Red goes in, Grandma, what big teeth you have, the better to eat you with, my dear, is eaten. And then it says, and that, dear children, is why you should never talk to strangers. The end. It doesn't have a happy ending. It has an ending that is meant to teach kids to not talk to strangers. She didn't do what she was told, and she died because of it. And so did her grandma, because she was a bad child. And that's the ending of Little Red Riding Hood. So I always think about that whenever I see things about Little Red Riding Hood. I always think, and that, dear children, is why you should never talk to strangers. And so when I did my version of Little Red Riding Hood, I'm like, I want to use more of an ending that goes along those lines. There's no woodsman, the wolf does not get filled up with rocks. But then I started realizing that I didn't want to be using actual wolves because that doesn't fit into my world that I'm writing for. There are not talking wolves. There are, however, there are magical people and stuff like that. So I'm like, so maybe they're called wolves because that's what they call the bandits in the woods. And so I managed to incorporate sort of a Robin Hood story into Little Red Riding Hood because I think those two things kind of go together very well. You've got people living in the woods, you've got someone coming into the woods who shouldn't be there. And so I thought it was a little more fun. I managed to put another legend that I love in with this fairy tale. And it enabled me to like take the fairy tale in a more natural progression and make more sense that she couldn't tell the difference between grandma and a wolf, because it's not an actual, Canis lupus with a big long hairy nose and stuff like that. And I didn't have to explain how the wolf could talk or anything like that. And so I molded it to fit my version of the story. And I made sure that it was not the same as anyone else's that I could find. And so that brings us to something else, actually, two other things that we need to talk about. When you're going to tell your story, you've picked your story now. You've picked that you are going to, you're going to do Little Red Riding Hood. Now, you need to decide, am I going to do the story crooked or straight, is what I always say. So you found your original version of Little Red Riding Hood that you are going to retell. Okay, so you've made sure that it's an older version. It's not something based on like a cartoon or something like that. It wasn't written a year ago and the ending is totally made up by the author that wrote it a year ago. You found an old version, you're going to do it. Now, crooked or straight? Straight would be a straight up retelling. Everyone knows it's Little Red Riding Hood. The girl is called Little Red Riding Hood. She wears a red cape. She's going through woods full of trees to her grandma's house, and a wolf stops her. So that's a straight retelling. So you need to decide either way, what elements do you need for that? Now, the elements you would need for a Little Red Riding Hood story. Okay, and we've got a couple of questions, by the way. And blah, blah, blah. I'm going to come back to those in just a second. Okay, because someone asked, we've got two very good, very specific questions. So I'm going to come back to those in a few minutes, okay, towards the end. Don't let me forget them. So a straight retelling of Little Red Riding Hood. The things that you would need are Little Red, right? You need woods for her to go through. She's delivering something. There's a wolf and there's grandma. So those are the kind of the basic things you need. Much like if you're doing a Cinderella story, what do you need? Okay, so you need a main character who is being picked on by family or step family. You need them to go to meet someone who will rescue them from this, like a prince, or at least someone who pulls them. And if you're doing a straightforward retelling of Cinderella, you're going to want it to be a prince or princess who pulls them out of the situation that they are in by marriage, or at least, recognizing that they deserve better or something like that. And you need to have like a glass slipper or a fur slipper, as it is in the older stories. Interesting fun fact about Cinderella, the fairy godmother is actually Disney. The older pre-Disney stories of Cinderella, there's not a fairy godmother. There's no bibbidi bobbidi boo. It is actually the tree that grows out of her mom's grave that delivers her the dresses. And she goes 3 nights. There are 3 balls. She goes 3 nights and she gets 3 different dresses that look differently, and the glass slippers. So it's quite a different story. So that's especially why I say, you may think a story because you've seen it 100 times, but things have been altered along the way by someone specifically like Disney or a very famous retelling of a certain fairy tale has sort of steered the course awry, and what you would be working off of is someone else's property that they have arranged. So anyway, look into that with Cinderella and stuff. Anyway, so straightforward retelling, Little Red Riding Hood, you're going to need those things. Now, what would a crooked telling be? And somebody's like, and then her stepsister's eyes get pecked out. Mom's ghost tree. Yep, all those things. The original is freaky, and one of the stepsisters cuts her toes off in order to fit them into the shoe, and the prince rides off with her, and it's the birds in the trees that tell him to look at the shoe, because there is blood pouring out of this glass slipper. Anyway, super gross, much like the Little Mermaid. Very, very grim, haha, punny. It's a Brothers Grimm story. But so if you're going to tell a story what I call crooked, so straightforward version would be, goes to the ball, glass slipper meets a handsome prince, or Little Red delivering cookies to sick grandma and a wolf eats her. So that would be a straight retelling. A crooked retelling would be something where you get to the end and you almost think, oh my gosh, that was Little Red Riding Hood. A crooked retelling of Little Red Riding Hood would be something along the lines of, if you have read, oh my gosh, what is it? It's Scarlet by Marissa Meyer, the second book in the Lunar Chronicles, where she wears a red hoodie and they have a delivery service that she runs with her grandma. Or I often do this as an exercise in writing courses where we've come up with it's in space. She has her own little shuttle, and it's not grandma. It's actually like the general in charge of the space station, and she's delivering sensitive material, and the wolf is like a space pirate, and she's known for the fact that her space suit and her ship are both painted red. And so that would be like a more crooked retelling. There's a wonderful series by Alexandra Harvey called the Drake Chronicles, which are YA books about a family of vampires, which they're just delightful. And I was literally through the first book, towards the end of the first book, when I suddenly smacked my head and I'm like, it's Snow White. It's the story of Snow White. Because you've got this girl and her 7 older brothers who are super protective of her. And their family are born vampires. So like when you hit like 16, you sort of fall into a coma, and if you survive, you become a vampire. So she hits 16, she falls into her coma. They put her like on this altar thing in their family's home to see if she revives into a vampire. She's got her 7 older brothers, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's a really subtle retelling of Snow White. And the Drake Chronicles are all based on different fairy tales, and they're all about this family. And they're absolutely wonderful. Totally recommend. Alexandra Harvey. But they're really subtle. You get into a story and then suddenly you go, she's Sleeping Beauty, because nobody has a name. Nobody's called Belle. Nobody's called Snow White or anything like that. They have their own names. But then as you get going, you're like, okay, this has the elements of Beauty and the Beast. This one has the elements of Sleeping Beauty. They're way fun. So for those of you, by the way, wondering about the books that I'm like flashing around and stuff like that, if you go after this to my website, which is jessicadaygeorge.com, I have a blog post you'll need to look for, but just do a quick search, and it's called the Fairy Tale Master List. And I have a blog post that is just a list of my all-time favorite fairy tale retellings. And so the Drake Chronicles are on there for sure. Harvey is the author's last name, but I've got a whole list of like 60 books on there, myth retellings and stuff like that. So just go to my blog sometime later, and there's tags for like fairy tales and stuff like that. And it's easy to find. It's only a few posts back. I keep reposting it. So anyway, so a crooked retelling would be something like they're in space, they're vampires and things like that. So that's a crooked retelling. So that's the kind of thing that you need to look at. So the other thing is, okay, so you're going to do this. You're going to retell your own version of Little Red Riding Hood. So you decide that you're going to do a very straightforward retelling. So it is going to be set in Germany in the 16th century. So you need to do some research. Now, how much research do you need to do? That is up to you. So, first of all, you need to do your research to figure out the story you're telling, like I've been saying, like what's sort of the original story. The other kind of research that I recommend if you're doing a retelling is to look up other versions of it. If you are going to do a Cinderella and you're like, mine is the most inventive Cinderella, I would definitely, I'm not saying it's not, it may very well be, but I would definitely look at reading Ella Enchanted, Amaranth Enchantment, Cinderella and the Glass Hill, like all the different versions of Cinderella that you can get your hands on. And just make sure that their angle that makes it unique isn't too similar to yours. If you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is so great, I'm going to do one that's set, in the modern day, and it's that she wants to go to a school dance, Cinderella, and it's not a glass slipper. It's like she decides to wear her Converse high tops and stuff like that. You're going to need to look into that because I think that's a Hillary Duff movie, like if you're going to say like, okay, why didn't she leave her family? Why didn't she just ditch her wicked stepmother? Well, that's been handled a couple of different ways. The new live action Cinderella talked about it. Ella Enchanted talks about why she didn't just ditch her horrible family. So you want to go in and make sure that your story is different. If you're thinking, okay, I'm going to do a really fun, really like lower middle grade version of Little Red Riding Hood, you're going to want to watch the movie Hoodwinked. You're going to want to look at picture books. You're going to want to look at, like, if anyone's done, novel versions, you're going to want to look at movies and stuff like that. And figure out, how your version is different, if there's anything you need to change to make sure it stays different, so that you're not seen as like basically copying someone else's version. And it really sucks when you think you've come up with a really original idea and then you look around and realize somebody's done exactly what you were thinking. It's horrible, and I'm so sorry, and it happens to everyone, but you need to brush it off and move on and brainstorm your own thing. So sorry, had to get a drink of water. So what you've got to do is then, so you do the research into your story, and that is really helpful, especially to find out like what are motivations, like why is that happening, why is Cinderella staying with her family. And especially with these older stories, there's some things you need to kind of look up maybe and understand why they would do that. Why would Cinderella stay with her family? If you know the story of Puss in Boots, he's a miller's son. He's the youngest of three. His dad gives, when he dies, the mill is inherited by his oldest brother. The second brother gets a little bit of money so that he can go off to the city and become a soldier. And so all that is left for the youngest child to inherit is the cat. And so he goes on his merry way with the cat. The cat makes him rich and famous. Now there's a reason why, you're like, why didn't the dad divide up the money better? Why didn't the brother let him stay on in the mill? There were actually laws in Europe about this, and there was nothing the dad could do about it. In Norway, especially, it was until the 20th century, there was literally a law that the oldest son or oldest male relative inherited literally everything, all the money, the entire farm, all the animals. So if you were one of like 4 sons and several daughters, your oldest brother was responsible for whether or not you had a place to live and food to eat after dad died. So that's why there are so many popular stories about the youngest son, the youngest daughter, the stepdaughter being treated badly and then ending up becoming a queen or a king or something like that, because everyone wanted that happy ending and no one was getting it in real life because there were laws kind of preventing that. So it was very common for the oldest son to inherit the farm. Another son would maybe go be a soldier, and then the other son would just sort of leave and try to find a job somewhere. And so there are a ton of stories in Scandinavia that are like Cinderella type stories, and they're actually called the Ash Lad. There was Askeladd, and there was a name for him, and he's basically Cinderella. He is a mistreated youngest son who didn't inherit anything, who's going around looking to make his fortune, and he often is kind to little old ladies and they turn out to be sorceresses and give him magic gifts, or he's so clever that he tricks a troll and he finds the troll's gold and he goes and marries a princess because It was the ultimate fantasy for people who didn't have anything else. So kind of look into that with your research. Why was this story told like this? Why, why would you send a child into the woods to deliver something to grandma? Was it a plague? Was there a plague? Did they need to get food to grandma? Why send your child? Was it because everyone else was sick? Was it because she'd already had the sickness and now she was okay? Did she have COVID, but now she had antibodies? Had she gotten the vaccine first? So now she's able to go deliver food to grandma? So you need to kind of look at that for your research. And then you need to research like your time period. So if you're going to do 16th century Germany, you need to really look that up. What were common names? And fortunately now with Google, you can find that in like 3 seconds. You can look up the top 100 baby names, in 1968 or 1668 Germany. You can look up what illnesses people were dying of. You can look up what their houses look like and see actual pictures and things like that. So it's so great now to do research. It's so easy. So you need to find out all these things and how they will affect your story. You don't, what would they eat? What would they wear? Would their names be and stuff like that? They always say that like you do all your research and then only 30% of it makes it into your book. So you're thinking, why did I do that other 70% of the research? Well, because there's definitely a feel to books where the research has been done. You can tell by the words the author uses. You can tell by just the casual way the clothing is mentioned. Like, oh, she pulled on her, her dirndl, she pulled on her tunic or whatever it is. You can tell by the casual way it's mentioned. I can always tell when an author has done just this much research and they really want you to know, because it'll be like she pulled on her, and then they'll have this whole technical list of every single item of clothing, and they'll do it like every time the person gets dressed or something like that. And then meanwhile, they'll have something totally random like that they're, eating hamburgers or whatever it is. But like they really want you to know that they looked up what clothing was like in the 1820s. I just recently read a romance novel that was set in like the 1820s, and I was laughing because I'm like, I love it that this person just basically decided there's just too much to worry about, so forget it. So she clearly had studied a map of London, and I even like looked it up, and like all her streets were correct, that they could walk down this one street and turn left and there you are and stuff like that. But she never described any of the men's clothes at all, and she barely described the women's clothes. Just like she had a gown, it was green and stuff like that. But there were like a couple of details about the place that I'm like, she clearly has lived there or looked it up really well on maps and needs us to know that she knows how to get around London. But she clearly did not care to look up anything about their clothes or what they would eat, because it was just like, and there was a wonderful feast with lots of food. And I'm like, that's it? That's all you got? So anyway, I thought it was really funny because you could really tell what things she'd researched and what she hadn't. So you kind of want to have that fuller experience of looking up everything that will affect your story, looking up the, basically the food, the names. You may only have 3 main characters, but how many side characters do you have? They need names too. You can't just call them Josh and Mackenzie if it's, 16th century Germany, because you forgot to look up more than 3 names for your people. So that's why I recommend doing a lot of research. Now, I noticed someone saying like, I'm going to research the future. So that is hard. So, okay, perfect. I've got 10 more minutes. So I'm going to do questions, but I just want to say it is hard to research the future. But what you can do is look up some of your science things, look up so that you can mention if they have gravity on their spaceship, you're going to want to look at, what do they need, a specific kind of engine? Do they need a big spinny thing like they do in 2001 or something like that? Or maybe create your own and mention it. Come up with a name like it's the Holtzbein Mercander engine, so everyone knows it's faster than light. Just toss that out there. You can kind of make up your own history, but it has to be just a little bit believable. Like, you have to have some things that are clearly grounded in reality. If you have stuff that's like so far out there and alien races that have married humans and had half alien babies and stuff, it needs to be really far in the future. You know, don't make the Lost in Space mistake where they were supposed to launch into space because Earth was dead in 1994. You know, if you're writing now, don't set your book where everyone's living on the moon and the Earth has been blown up in like 2010 and 5 or that tells you how old I am. Don't set your book in like 2030 and claim that we'll all have faster than light travel and alien races helping us because the Earth has been blown up, because by the time your book is finished and published, that will only be 2 years away pretty much. So anyway, so that's my last bit of advice there, but let's quickly look at our questions. Advice for following the fairy tale that you're retelling to guide you, but not allowing it to absorb your focus so much so you struggle to add your own take on it. I would say after you've looked up your fairy tale and you found the version that you're going off of and blah, 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 all that other stuff I've said, put it away. Don't keep referring back to it. I call this, and I use it for research too, I call this the spaghetti principle. Like, they claim that, you know, when pasta or spaghetti is done, you can throw it at the wall, and if it sticks, it's ready. So I always say, like, so I've done the research, I've boiled the water, I've read the story a few times, and whatever is stuck in my head after I put it aside, that's what the important things were to me. So if it didn't stick in my head, then it wasn't important enough. And then maybe when you're editing, you'll need to go back through for a reference or something like that. But I would just like ignore it. And if you find yourself going like, oh no, I need to look this up. Oh no, were her shoes glass or were they made out of wood or something like that? It doesn't matter then. You know, just stop yourself and go, but do I want them to be glass or wood? Do I want Little Red Riding Hood's cape to be made out of silk or velvet? What do I want? Ask yourself what you want at that point. If you can't remember the original story, then do what you want. The Snow White vampire telling is called, I think they changed the title for the paperback. I read a really early copy. It's the Drake Chronicles by Alexandra Harvey. And it's listed on my website on a blog post called The Fairy Tale Master List. So, would the aftermath of a story like Their Children be straight or crooked? That would be completely new. If you are writing about Cinderella's children, there is nothing that you're using. So it would depend on how you envision the original story. If you didn't rewrite Cinderella, you're only writing about their children, then you do have to have a version of Cinderella in your head that you are writing a sequel to. And so you're going to need to reference that. And it could be set in space or whatever you wanted, in which case you're going to need to refer back more. You know, if you got your Little Red Riding Hood set in space, you're going to need to occasionally say like, and her daughter remembered the time when she, you know, when her mother had saved the world by blowing up her red spaceship or something like that. You're going to need to refer back to it, but I wouldn't call that crooked or straight because it's entirely new. Yes, I have read the Lunar Chronicles. That is how I was able to cite them as a reference. Okay, so I'm doing a Cinderella retelling, and people are typing in the chat. You need to switch over and type in the Q&A, please, because that is what I'm looking at. There are like 900 things in the chat, and a lot of them are LOL or you spelled your name wrong, which I believe is weird. So let me see. I answered that, and I answered that, and I answered that. Okay, so Becca says, I am doing a Cinderella retelling because there are some parts in all versions I've read that I hate. Yes, but because of how I'm changing it, the shoe doesn't only fit Cinderella. Interesting. She had to earn the prince's love. Really only the beginning is Cinderella. Do I call it a retelling? Yes, you do. If it has the name Cinderella involved, if there is a shoe that has to fit on a certain foot, that is a Cinderella story, no matter how vague it is. It is a retelling. So go ahead and call it a retelling because that gives your reader a frame of reference. When you tell someone, oh, it's loosely based on Cinderella, no matter how loosely based, they have certain expectations. So the bad thing is you're going to have to fulfill some of those expectations. You're going to have, certain notes, just like we talked about. Little Red Riding Hood's got to wear something red. There's got to be a wolf character. There's got to be a grandma character. With a Cinderella retelling, you're going to have at some point a shoe or something else that had to fit for her to be with the prince. You're going to have that she's a youngest child, a mistreated child, a stepchild, or something like that, or he, like you've got to have those certain elements. So what you need to look at is what are the key elements of your story. If you're doing Theseus and the Minotaur, you've got to have Theseus and you've got to have the Minotaur in some way, shape, or form. If you are doing Cinderella, you've got to have Cinderella and a glass slipper in some shape or form. And then it is totally retelling. It might be an extremely crooked retelling, it might be a sequel, but whatever it is, it's got to have those elements that the reader can go, aha, I know this story, it's Cinderella, I want to see what they did differently. If you want to do a modern day version of the book written in 1938, Rebecca, is that still a retelling? I think so. If it's inspired by that book and you're just like I love the basic story of Rebecca, but I want to do something completely different with it, that's sort of different. If you're not going to have those same elements where the unnamed narrator has married this person whose first wife Rebecca died dramatically, if it's nothing to do with that, if there's not somebody dying on a boat and a creepy housekeeper yelling at her all the time, then I would say you could just be like, it's inspired by or influenced by, but if you're using actual elements of Rebecca, you are going to have to look up whether or not that is still owned, and I have no idea. You are going to want to look up and see like, if you're going to have that Rebecca died on a boat and was it murder, and the main character doesn't ever have her name mentioned, and all that stuff that are like the key elements of Rebecca, that's a retelling. If you're just going to be like, I want to write about this guy who murdered his wife on a boat, that could be anything. So I hope that helps. That's a puzzler though, because I have no idea about Rebecca. I don't know if the Du Maurier estate owns anything right now. So we answered that. Okay. Melina says, do you have any advice for allowing the fairy tale you're retelling to guide you, but not allowing it? Oh, I did that one, Melina. Okay. Hopefully good. How do you figure out where your characters are from? Says Emery Jessup. We have like 1 minute left. I don't know what this means. You mean like you are thinking of like a type of character, like an orphan child that has a magic mirror or something like that, and you're not sure if what story that's from? I would say you could Google it. Or if you have an image in your mind of a book you've read one time that's a story about such and such a girl with a magic mirror or something, and you're trying to find that story, that's again like almost like a Google issue. I'm not sure what you're asking. I'm going to ignore that. I'm very sorry, Emery. If you want to, you can always email me through my website. If you go to my website, there's an option to contact me and you can email me. And if you want to email me some longer questions or something like that, go ahead, because I don't understand that question, but I would like to. So if you want to email me, that would be great. And then I can answer it later. Advice to aspiring authors. What a great way to end real quick. So there are 3 things that I tell aspiring authors. You have to write. You have to write all the time. Writing, your brain, it's a muscle, the whole thing, it needs to be exercised. So when you write every day, even lists of names that you think are cool names you might want to use, or describe a room, or describe a character, or write the first chapter of a story and then abandon it and write the first chapter of another story the next day, you need to write and be working that brain so that your brain is always in writing mode. So when you see things that are inspired by things, you know how to capture them and write them down. So you've got to write. The next thing that I recommend is that you read all the time. And Julie talked about this too. And I love Julie Berry, and she's one of my dear friends, and she gives such great writing advice, but because she's right. You have to read all the time. You have to read all kinds of things, not just for research, not just the genre that you like. You need to read poetry and nonfiction and you know, picture books and whatever, because all those things keep your brain seeing what is out there and what is good, and you start to learn the difference between good and bad writing and things you like and don't like, and that inspires and informs your own writing. And then the third piece of advice is to save your own writing. You absolutely, if you write a first chapter of something and then you look at it the next day, you're like, well, this is stupid. I don't care. Put it aside anyway, save it. You may want to use parts of that idea later. You may want to use that list of names later. You may come back to that story in 10 or 20 years and be like, you know, that was really silly and it's sort of Harry Potter fan fiction, but I bet I could change it around and make something else out of it. This series, The Writer's Reign, started as a story I wrote when I was 13 years old in a Cabbage Patch Kid journal that I'd gotten for a birthday. And the last scene of this book, the third book in the series, is something that I started planning and writing down when I was in junior high, because I wanted a horse so bad, and this is my own horsey version, but it is completely different from what I wrote down, except for the fact that it's this girl and her horse, and they can sort of feel each other's emotions, and she has an evil uncle trying to take her horse away. And those are the basic things I took from that very silly story that I wrote, that I found a few years later. And I'm like, well, this is so embarrassing, but I kept it anyway because I thought it was funny. And then as I got older and had written more books, I looked back and went, the bones of that story were good and I could turn it into something better. So you save your writing because you can always recycle it and use something later. And that I have to go. And I think we've got an excellent keynote coming up by Christopher Paolini. So those of you who did not get your questions answered, I want you to take your questions, hop over to my website, jessicadaygeorge.com, click on contact and write them down for me, and I will email you back. Okay. So thank you guys for listening to me, and I hope everyone in the chat is fine and that was all in good fun, because some of the things are starting to sound a little mean. I hope everyone's okay though, and I will hopefully hear from you guys on my emails. Okay, bye.